Hello, everyone. We'll get started here in just a moment. Our speaker tonight is Nolan Gray. He is a PhD student in urban planning at the University of California, Los Angeles. He's also a research director for California YIMBY, an acronym which means Yes in My Backyard, a program that focuses on statewide housing advocacy and has helped pass 8 bills throughout the state to expand access to economic opportunity. Gray earned a Master of City and Regional Planning degree at Rutgers University and received BAs in Philosophy and Political Science from the University of Kentucky. He was a research fellow in the Urbanity Project at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. His research focuses on land use regulation, housing affordability, and urban design. Nolan was a Mercatus Center Frederick Bastiat Fellow during the 2020 to 2021 academic year for the Mercatus Center. Please welcome Nolan Gray.
Okay, cool. How's everybody doing? Everybody nice and sugared up? It's good to be here. It's good to be back in Hillsdale. How's it going, stranger? I gave a version of this talk, actually not too long ago, but this is the refined post-book tour version, so you're getting the director's cut. So it's great to be here. Thanks to Praxis for having me. Of course, Alec reached out to me and was like, you guys have solved the housing affordability crisis in California. Can you come to Michigan and explain how you got the housing so cheap? No, sorry, that was a joke. But really, it's great to be out here speaking. I think you'll find this is going to be an issue that touches on a lot of aspects of your life, and it's probably touching on a lot of policy issues that folks here are chewing on. So let's set the table a little bit. I've been working on housing affordability and city planning issues for probably close to a decade now. And for a really long, this keeps moving. Okay. For a really long time, I had to justify this kind of as an issue for people to be thinking about. And okay, I think the wheel is spinning. Everything is going to go perfectly from here on out. So for the longest time, I had to justify this as an issue in a lot of places, right? In California and places like New York, we know housing affordability is a problem. We've known it's a problem for a long time. I was in Hawaii. They know housing affordability is a problem. But in many parts of the US, I think there was this notion of this is a coastal problem. These regulations that I'm going to describe are really only an issue in places like California. We don't have that problem here. Of course, fast forward to 2021, and that completely changes, right? Over the course of the last few years, home price appreciation in places like Arizona or Florida or Tennessee, historically very affordable places, have spiraled out of control. Some of that's a function of just short-term COVID-related shocks, right? Supply chain issues, inflation, interest rates, labor shortages. But a lot of it is actually exposing longer-term problems with the way we plan our cities and the policies we have in place that put us on a path currently to housing affordability crises spreading nationwide. And that's what's happened over the last couple of years. So I'm going to talk about a policy that I think is actually central to that story that a lot of people don't know about. And that policy is zoning. I'm going to talk about what zoning is and where it comes from. I'm going to talk about what went wrong with zoning and why it matters to you. And then I'll talk about where we go from here and some of the policy reforms that are being discussed in places like California, but also here nearby in a place like Ann Arbor or in states all across the country. So I'm going to take the temperature of the audience real quick. Who would consider themselves an expert on zoning? Any zoning experts? Okay. Who knows what zoning is, maybe vaguely? They've heard of it, right? Okay, cool. And then who are the happy, normal, well-adjusted people that don't know anything about zoning? No one here is happy, healthy, well-adjusted? Cool. I'm going to take a bunch of you who are in that second section, and we're going to move you up to the third section. So a little bit of wonky stuff that we have to get out of the way. Zoning comes down to 2 documents. It's a state-delegated power to local governments to adopt 2 things. These things work closely together. The first is a zoning ordinance, which says here are all the different zoning districts that apply in our city. Here are the use rules and the density rules and a whole bunch of other 1,000 little rules about what you can and can't do on property all over the city. And that is connected to a zoning map, which places every single parcel in the city into one of these zoning districts, telling you what you can and can't do. You can look this up. I was mentioning this earlier when I drove in. One of the first things I saw in Hillsdale was a zoned community, right? So Hillsdale has zoning. You can look this up, and if you understand what the zoning is for Hillsdale and many communities, you can actually figure out why it looks the way it does. So what are these rules doing? There are two main components of zoning. The first is segregating land uses. So, who here has played? Do we have SimCity players? City Skylines? Anybody? It's okay. It's a safe space. You can admit. Yeah. So, right, you know this. Zoning is breaking out the city and saying there are certain parts of town where residential, commercial, and industrial are allowed. Right? Pretty inoffensive. But there's a whole bunch of different distinctions within each of those categories. So you'll have different zoning districts where, for example, multifamily or apartments are allowed. You'll have many districts where the only thing that's allowed is a single family home. Commercial might be divided up. Some commercial districts might allow strip malls, others might allow office buildings. Within industrial, some industrial zones might only allow light industrial, like research spaces or office parks. Some might allow heavy industry, right, with actual real emissions. The highest and best use within the system is the detached single family home. And this is a really unique feature of US zoning. As I'll talk about more later on, the vast majority of residential areas in almost every US city are reserved for detached single family homes. This is the thing that we say, this is the only thing that you can build in this residential area. And a lot of people here use segregation and they think like, well, yeah, of course it makes sense. You don't want like factories next to schools, right? Like that's obvious. But a lot of the use segregation that zoning is entrenching is actually quite a bit more complex, and it's much more of a social project about what a good community looks like and what an appropriate home should look like, right? And you can see this here in this great graphic from a 1950s Wisconsin zoning document. It's from Wisconsin, so you all can hate it. Wisconsin zoning document setting out what are the rules in the city's R1 district, right? And you can sort of see the social project here of like mom, dad, 2 kids, car in the back, permitted land uses include golf courses, right? The second big thing that zoning is doing is it's regulating density and the amount of floor area or homes that you can build on any particular lot in a city. So a lot of people know, for example, yeah, okay, cities have height limits in certain areas, right? Like that's, again, pretty inoffensive. But the rules go quite a bit more complex. You have rules like floor area ratios, which say, based on the size of the lot, you can only build so much floor area. That's depicted here. You have rules concerning how closely to the edge of a lot a structure can actually be. You have rules about how much of the lot can be built up. You have various rules about how many homes you can build on any particular parcel based on how large that parcel is. So in many cases, these rules are very strict, they're very prescriptive, and if you actually dig into your zoning code and understand what's in here, you can make sense of why your community looks the way it does, for better or worse. And before I go full PhD student on you all, I'm going to set a timer. Right, so I want to take a moment to distinguish here, like zoning is a small part of city planning. So a lot of people I think tend to conflate the two, but zoning is a small part of this broader human project of figuring out how we plan our cities, right? And humans have been basically doing this like since we started settling down. You need to sit down and plan out streets and parks and where the city hall is going to go. But even within land use planning, there are a whole bunch of other things that aren't really zoning, right? So of course you have historic preservation, you have subdivision regulations which control the process of breaking large lots into new neighborhoods. You have the building code, right, which actually regulates buildings on the basis of health and safety. These are all separate sets of rules that I'm not going to be talking about today. These are, they all have their own sort of benefits and challenges. I'm really going to be talking about zoning, which is that comprehensive citywide use segregation and density limits. Okay, what went wrong with zoning? Does anyone know where the background image here is? Does anyone recognize that? You'll get twice the extra credit. So this is West LA. This is what we call Condo Canyon. It's a very unusual pattern of development with high rises next to single family homes. This is the type of thing that you can understand when you understand, like, why does this look like this, right? This is not normally what a land use market would produce. You start to understand it when you understand zoning. So, of course, the main thing that a lot of folks start to think a lot about lately when they think of zoning is housing affordability. Really, I think there's a very, very, very robust literature connecting really strict zoning rules to housing affordability problems. We've made efforts, researchers and scholars have made efforts to try to quantify how restrictive different places are. you'll be pleased to know that both Detroit and Grand Rapids are a little bit more liberal, but they still have a lot of these rules. Places like California, Metro Phoenix, very restrictive. DC, New York, right? We see an association between the really strict zoning rules and really high housing costs. So, but what's the connection? I'll argue there's three connections here. The first is that zoning rules often restrict new supply altogether. The second is that they often mandate housing that's quite a bit more expensive. And the third is that they require a slow, unpredictable entitlement process. So here's zone capacity for LA over the last 60 years. What's happened over in a place like LA is that the actual amount of housing that our zoning code will allow anywhere in the city has become quite a bit more restricted, right? So over the course of the 60s, 70s, and to a certain extent the 80s, zoning codes were increasingly tightened such that very, very little housing could actually be built in Los Angeles. What do I mean by that? So here on the left, these are the municipal boundaries of Los Angeles. Yes, Los Angeles has very weird municipal boundaries. We really had to make sure that we got the port down there. But anything that's any shade of color in this map is an area of the city where the plan says residential is allowed. So if it's blue or if it's pink, the city has said this area is appropriate for residential. Now, if it's blue, any form of residential is allowed here. Single-family homes, townhouses, duplexes, small apartment buildings. If it's pink, the only thing you can build is a detached single-family home, right? So historically, here's an image of a duplex. Historically, as parts of Los Angeles would become more expensive, you might tear down a single-family home and replace it with a duplex, small apartment building. The city would get denser, the housing supply would increase to absorb all that demand, and housing would remain relatively affordable. But in today, in all of the pink areas, the only thing you can build, in many cases, is a single-family home. And because land prices are so high in a place like Los Angeles, this is going to take the form of a very, very expensive kind of McMansion, right? Now, to opine on the architecture of this particular building, it's not one I would pick, but this is the only type of thing you can build in any of those pink areas of Los Angeles. And then Los Angeles elected officials say, well, we don't know why we have a housing crisis. Well, I think I have an idea. There are a whole bunch of other rules that increase the cost of housing by just making the housing that is built be quite a bit more expensive. So many zoning codes have what are called minimum lot size rules, which say that you're not allowed to have a single family home unless you have a lot of at least a certain size. Now in rural areas where you're on well and septic, there's actual health and safety reason. You don't want to be spraying out human waste too close to your well for reasons that I probably shouldn't have to explain. But in an urban context where you have water and sewer, it's actually just, there's no actual reason, health and safety reason to have really large lot sizes. The only function that they serve is to increase the cost of housing and exclude anyone who can't afford housing at that income level. And we've researched this, and you can actually see these regulations seem to have a binding constraint, right? So that, here's a distribution of all the lots in Pflugerville, Texas. Not a context where you normally think the regulations are really restrictive. But what we see is, right, that orange line there is the actual zoned minimum lot size, and we see this incredible clustering right just above it. That suggests that the rule is actually potentially forcing lot sizes to be larger than they might otherwise have been. Of course, that increases the cost of housing. It also forces new development to just take up a lot of additional land to sprawl even further out into the countryside. And then, of course, all of these zoning processes just involve a lot of additional process and entitlement risk. Entitlement's what we call the process of getting your zoning permits. So surely folks here know NIMBY, right? What does NIMBY stand for?
Not in my backyard.
Thank you. Yes. So what we've got with this whole system of regulation that places really, really tight rules on everything that can be built is that if you want to build anything, you generally have to get relief from the zoning rules, which is a political process. You're going to have public hearings. You're going to have to complete a giant environmental report. You can get sued. In many cases, you need the approval of city council. And so what has happened is, like, people with highly unrepresentative preferences, strong preferences against anything getting built near them, have captured the process. So in places like California and New York, this has been going on for a long time. The type of person who comes out to a Tuesday 10 a.m. meeting is not terribly representative of the broader community. They come out and they're highly, highly opposed to housing, and they're the only people that show up, and the housing doesn't get built. Play that over again multiple times and spread it across the country, And it just becomes very hard to build housing, especially if it's housing serving vulnerable populations, like folks coming out of homelessness or maybe low-income seniors, any sort of group that people might not want near them. Good luck building it through this process. One more thing I'll flag is that collectively these rules have actually made it really hard to build starter homes. So in cities all across the country, there's actually this real gap at the bottom of the market. Homes where maybe young professionals starting out or retirees who want to downsize or just moderate income households, they can't actually get a home. There's no housing available at the lower range of the market such that people get trapped renting. And again, policymakers puzzle over this. They say, why did that happen? But if you actually look at the zoning rules on the books, in many cases, it's illegal to build something like a small lot shotgun home, right? Or it's illegal to build something like a duplex, right? It's illegal to build a small multifamily building that could be condoized and could actually get people into a place where they can own their own home and they're not stuck renting. This is, I think, why this movement has really taken off, actually. I think a lot of millennials and Zoomers have increasingly realized, oh, I don't have a path to homeownership, maybe in the place where I'm from or the place where I wanted to move for a job. I think that's part of what the genesis of YIMBY in California is a lot of young tech workers moved to the Bay Area and realized, oh, I can't actually stay here. I think you're seeing that all across the country play out increasingly. I've given a few of these talks in the Mountain West, and people say, yeah, like our kids can't afford to stay here in a place like Utah or Montana. These problems are only going to get worse unless we seriously contend with some of these rules. I'll touch briefly on some of the other related elements here that I go into in the book, but I've been told not to give everything away because you have to buy the book. So a couple of sort of interesting, weird knock-on effects have happened as a result of this. Because zoning rules are especially strict in certain places, especially our most productive places, right? Places like Boston or greater Los Angeles. What we're seeing now is that for the first time in US history, Americans actually move from more productive places to less productive places. So historically, right, of course, we all know examples like the Great Migration of African Americans out of the South. And where I'm from, Kentucky, there were huge migrations of people out of very impoverished eastern Kentucky. These people were moving to what was then, a thriving industrial Midwest, Northeast. Americans historically would move from poor places to rich places. They would move to opportunity. And that was part of what kept America so much the land of opportunity. It also helped to deal with regional inequality, right? So poor places, workers would move away from, and then wages would gradually rise. Affluent places, more workers would move to, wages would gradually fall, and the U.S. remained a relatively equitable place. Like until the 70s, we didn't even have this notion of like expensive cities and poor cities. You would just move to where your job was, right? It wasn't like, oh yeah, San Francisco is extremely expensive and Grand Rapids is extremely affordable. There wasn't even this notion. But what's happened over the last few decades is some places have become incredibly expensive such that now Americans are forced to move. And you expect some of this migration out of poor places, and it still happens. West Virginia and Mississippi are very impoverished states. People have to move away. But like people leaving New York and California, right? That's kind of weird, right? Something's up there. And there's pretty good evidence that this has had broader economic costs. To the extent that young software engineers can't move to the Bay Area, or young biochemical engineers can't move to a place like San Diego because the housing's so expensive, our country's just poorer and much more innovative as a result. You don't get the big cities and the agglomeration benefits. Another thing that you're seeing too as a result of this is the rise of supercommutes. These are bad. This is like people commuting more than an hour and a half. I say they're bad because it's super commute makes it sound kind of cool, right? Like I'm a super commuter. No, you don't want to be a super commuter. We have more and more Americans who have 90-minute commutes. And some people, right, that might be a lifestyle choice. They might want to live on a farm far outside of a city, and they're like, sure, I'll have a brutal commute every day. That's, so I can live the life I want. But many Americans in high-cost cities do this out of necessity because it's the only way they can afford a home, right? And I'm going to give a lot of LA examples if you'll forgive me, but in a place like Los Angeles, if you want to own your own home and you're maybe a lower middle income family, historically you had no problem. You could easily afford a home in Los Angeles. Now if you want to do that, you have to move out to the desert, right? You're going to be an hour and a half outside the city, and you're going to have these brutal super commutes. I don't think it's possible to overstate the harm that these types of norms do to communities, right? Like imagine if you have young children and you have to leave the home an hour and a half before work, and then you don't get home until an hour and a half after work is done, right? And that just destroys your family life. But these are the types of things that people have to do because we refuse to build housing close to existing job centers. Oh, that's a fun transition. Of course, also too, these rules are pretty closely wrapped up in historical attempts to segregate cities, right? The government trying to actually force cities to be segregated. So a lot of modern zoning codes come in the aftermath of the 1917 decision, Buchanan v. Worley. So a little bit of background there. In the 19-teens, a lot of cities in the Upper South are trying to institutionalize explicit racial segregation of neighborhoods. So amid these great migrations, cities like St. Louis are saying, okay, whites can't move to black blocks, blacks can't move to white blocks. And of course they try to say, oh, well, it's not racist because we're also not letting white people do something. Of course, the Supreme Court was like, no, we're not going to allow what would have been explicitly like South Africa-style apartheid. But so what these local governments do in the aftermath of that is they figure out that we can actually adopt zoning codes that segregate cities not explicitly by race, but if we can say there are certain neighborhoods where only wealthy people get to live, and there are certain areas where poor people get to live, we can effectively get the same result. Of course, the irony here is that a lot of people who might have stated values of, wanting to live in an equitable, integrated community still support a lot of these rules, right? So here on the left, you have these yard signs that started popping up, I guess, as soon as Trump got elected. All are welcome here, right? Or no matter who you are, we're glad you're our neighbor. It's a nice sentiment, nothing wrong with the sentiment. This is from Austin, by the way. And then, of course, right next to it is a yard sign opposing a set of changes to the Austin zoning that would have made it allowed to build, made it easier to build a variety of housing types all over the city. And so, I mean, here you have this person sort of articulating like very, very like radically conflicting views. And I think people don't realize actually the explicitly segregationist origins of a lot of these rules that we still have on the books today. Of course, there's also the environmental consideration, right? So zoning codes in many cases have made it illegal to build some of the denser, more mixed-use neighborhoods that cities historically had, right? Of course, not everybody wants to live in a row of townhouses, right? Some people want to live in a neighborhood like this. Nothing wrong with that. I grew up in a neighborhood like this. But if prices are any indication, many Americans would actually prefer something like a townhouse that's close to where they work. The problem is that the regulations say you can build this all day. You can build it almost as far outside of the city as you like. But if you want to take an inner neighborhood and turn it into something like this, it's not going to be allowed. Or it's going to require permissions that make it prohibitively difficult. The premise of zoning is that residential and commercial are going to be strictly segregated, right? You're not going to have things like corner groceries. Anyone spend some time in DC? A lot of policy wonks in here. You guys all go do summer internships. If you walk around a lot of older neighborhoods in DC, you see a lot of buildings that look like this, right? That's a pretty funny looking house, right? Like my house doesn't have a showroom. That's because this is former commercial. That's a former, it's like probably a former barbershop or a former deli, some sort of community neighborhood serving commercial use. Those types of commercial uses used to actually be very common in neighborhoods, the types of thing that you need every day, right? So you want it to be within walking distance. Of course, zoning says, well, we're not going to allow that anymore, and you actually could not turn that into commercial. You're going to get in your car and drive across town to go to a strip mall that's going to have your commercial. These things are going to be physically separated, and everything's going to be mediated through car ownership. Again, some people like that. I think a lot of people like that lifestyle, and you have that lifestyle in many U.S. cities. But if you want to live in a neighborhood that maybe has a corner grocery, and a mixture of housing typologies where you can live in that neighborhood over the course of your life in different types of homes, in many cases you don't have that option. We actually make it illegal for you to have that choice. And I mean, the car ownership piece is really baked into it, right? And I'm not anti-car. I mean, I have a Toyota 2012 Prius. It's pretty cool. It's an applause line, by the way. But what gets funky with contemporary zoning is that we say, like, we're going to write into law that everybody's going to have a car. Like, literally, it's illegal in most U.S. cities today to build an apartment building without building a really large parking garage or parking lot. Now, I don't doubt that many of these new apartment buildings, you wouldn't be able to lease them or you wouldn't be able to sell the units without building parking. But we don't give people the option to actually not have these if they don't want them. And this, it's important to stress, this parking doesn't come free, right? It costs, if you have to build a parking garage with a multifamily building, right, that can raise the cost of a new unit by $50,000. So if we're talking like a new $250,000 condo, right, the type of starter home that we need more of, if you have a 2 parking space per unit parking mandate, you're literally requiring that person to consume twice as much space and potentially paying a sixth more for their home. And that person might have preferred to have 1 parking space or no parking space, right? They might be in a neighborhood where they can walk or ride a bike or take a bus to work. We don't let people actually make those trade-offs. We only allow a certain type of development. And that development, of course, tends to be very expensive. Okay, so is everybody depressed? Good. Do we need more cookies? Can we throw the cookies out like a frisbee? Okay. Well, if you want a cookie, you just look back and open your mouth. So where do we go from here? The good news is that we're in a real moment right now where all of this stuff is changing in a really big way. So of course, local governments can and should remove a lot of these regulatory barriers to new housing production. Of course, the politics often don't work at the local level, so we're going to need states to put up guardrails around how local governments administer these powers. To say, hey, we're not going to allow you to enforce rules that block the affordable starter homes and mixed-use neighborhoods that we want and need. But in the longer term, I think we need a fundamental rethink of this whole system, this whole notion that we can sit down and comprehensively say for every single parcel in the city what the appropriate use and density is. So at the local level, we've seen a lot of exciting reform, right? So many cities have legalized accessory dwelling units. Does anyone here know what an accessory dwelling unit is? ADU? Mother-in-law unit? Granny flat? These are essentially small additional rental units that might go in the garage of a home or in a basement or an attic. They're called granny flats because many people build them to house aging parents. In the California context, many people build them so their young adult children can move back and live with them while they save up money. These were very common in neighborhoods, but zoning in many cases made them completely illegal. But what we've seen all over the country is that accessory dwelling units are being legalized. Many cities are going even further and saying, hey, if it's a residential neighborhood, we've said residential is appropriate here. You can build a duplex or a small fourplex building, and we're no longer going to ban that as a matter of policy. Many cities are getting rid of parking requirements altogether and saying, hey, developers and consumers can figure out how much parking they need and if they want to make that trade-off, and the sky's not falling. This reform is happening all over the country. Jurisdictions are saying, cool, we don't actually need to have these comprehensive lists where we say, and these lists get kind of funny, by the way, and not just funny to zoning people. There was many zoning ordinances will have mandatory parking for bars, right? Which is so much for drunk driving. Or they'll have really weird, the amount of parking required for a pool will be based on the number of gallons of water in that pool, as if the gallons of water drive. So many cities are just saying, okay, these rules don't make any sense whatsoever. We can just scrap them and clear a hurdle to infill housing development. Of course, the most important story of this year so far, I'm sure you guys all heard about it, my hometown of Lexington, Kentucky even removed parking requirements, right? So this is happening all across the country in a range of different sort of partisan and ideological contexts. Another local reform that I always like to highlight is Houston lowering minimum lot sizes. So Houston, like a lot of cities today, was dealing with a problem where in their inner neighborhoods, they were finding that traditional post-war single-family home on a 5,000 square foot lot was getting to be far more expensive than your average, young professional family could afford. So they worked with local builders and they said, what are some typologies that we can clear barriers to make sure that we get additional housing built? What they came up with was lowering minimum lot sizes to allow new townhouse development. So they said, well, we can't build anything that's affordable on a 5,000 square foot lot because land prices are just too high. But if you drop those lot requirements down to 1,400 square feet, we can build townhouses that are going to be a fraction of the price of a lot of the old homes that they're replacing. You can take one home on a 5,000 square foot lot and turn it into 3 townhouses, right? That reform took effect in 1999, and it's resulted in about 25,000 new homes being built within the existing urban area of Houston at no cost to taxpayers. It was literally just removing a regulatory barrier and allowing new development to leverage existing infrastructure. Of course, I think another issue related to this that's at top of mind for a lot of people is homelessness, right? I think a lot of people tend to think of housing affordability and homelessness maybe as separate issues, but we know these things are very, very tightly related, right? So a lot of people say, well, homelessness is just about people having mental illnesses or substance abuse problems. And that's true, that's a risk factor for people falling into homelessness. But that doesn't explain why there's so much variation between a place like Los Angeles and a place like Dallas, right? Why does Los Angeles have a much higher rate of homelessness than Dallas? It's not because people in LA have mental health issues, though you might think that. It's not because LA has especially high rates of substance abuse. It's because the housing is a lot more expensive. The typical person who is homeless is not actually living on the street. The typical person who is homeless is sleeping in their car or sleeping on the couches of friends or loved ones or bouncing around in temporary housing options, right? Those people, to remain housed, all they need is inherently affordable housing. And historically, the market actually would provide a lot of that. So in cities, you would have things like single room occupancies or residential hotels where you could rent a very small room. Maybe you had a shared bathroom, maybe you had a shared kitchen space, but you had a very small apartment, not glamorous, not most people's first pick, but better than living in your car or better than living in a tent. In many US cities, with one exception, I'll talk about that in a minute, it's illegal to build these. It is illegal to build an SRO. And then we wonder why people end up getting stuck in homelessness. In suburban and rural areas, the bottom of the housing safety net was in many cases manufactured housing. It's very cheap. You can put these on very, very small lots. We built many hundreds of thousands of these types of communities in the 50s and 60s. This provided people even a little bit of equity to the extent that they own the trailers. And this was what the housing safety net looked like. It was actually provided in many cases by the market, right? People would serve these communities. Of course, in most incorporated communities today, it's illegal to create a new mobile home or trailer park community. Not seeing a lot of movement on these two areas yet. There was a bill in Arizona to legalize SROs, and a few states have tried to remove discriminatory regulations against manufactured housing, but there's still work to be done. So those were all local reforms that I think are really exciting. Of course, I'm at California YIMBY, where we advocate for policy change at the state level. In California, the state has said, okay, look, the politics just aren't lining up. Local governments are not leading on zoning reform. And that makes sense, right? Like, local governments are at the beck and call of the homeowners who show up at these meetings who might not have future theoretical residents in mind. But so at the state level, what we've done in California is we've put up some guardrails around how these powers are administered. So ADUs, I mentioned earlier, we just legalized ADUs statewide and said, look, anywhere in California, if a homeowner wants to build an additional unit on his or her property, here's the statewide standards, here are the rules you have to follow. You got to get the permits out by a certain date. You can't charge crazy fees. You can set very small rules about what it looks like, but that's it. And what we found is when these rules started to come online after 2016 is that a lot of homeowners actually really wanted to build ADUs. So now we're to a point where 1 in 3 homes permitted in California is an accessory dwelling unit. It's not solving the problem, but it's creating a lot of new housing in neighborhoods that historically maybe hadn't built a single home in decades. We've done a whole bunch of other small things to try to clear a path for housing production. So SB 9 allows duplexes and small lot single family homes in residential neighborhoods across the state. SB 10 removed these really onerous environmental review mandates that we often had for cities trying to do the right thing. AB 2011 said, hey, look, like on strip malls and dying office parks across the state, you can build multifamily. And then AB 2097, one I was really excited about, was we just removed parking requirements within a half-mile of transit, right? In areas where people might actually prefer to live without off-street parking, stop mandating it, right? So we're in a good place and we're making a lot of reform, and I'm happy to say that we're very much not alone. One of the cool things about this policy area is that it's not particularly partisan, it's not particularly ideological. right? Republicans might frame this issue as property rights and workforce housing. Democrats might frame this issue as racial equity and sustainability. But it's funny because we're all across the country, right? I was just in Montana testifying on a pro-housing zoning reform bill, and you had rock-ribbed conservatives, big sky conservatives, advocating for the same types of zoning reform as super progressive policymakers in the Bay Area, right? Minneapolis, 60-day shot clock rule. We're seeing a lot of reform happen on this. Unfortunately, I don't think any in Michigan quite yet. At the federal level, too, there's action. And again, it's bipartisan. These bills have unsubtle names. Yes, in my backyard. Build More Housing Near Transit Act. That sounds like the name of a bill that we would do for like youth assembly. But so there's a whole bunch of other things that are happening at the federal level where federal policymakers are trying to say, how can we put incentives for local governments to adopt this type of reform? But we also have lessons to learn from abroad. So in policymaking, right, the US, we love to teach everybody else how to do things, right? There was this recent Buttigieg DOT initiative where we're going to do this international trainings on like how to build transportation infrastructure. And everyone was like, yeah, other countries are going to teach us, right? And it was like, okay, no, the idea was that the US was going to go out and explain to other countries how to build transportation infrastructure. Everybody in the transportation policy world was like, we're the least efficient builder on earth. What in the world are you talking about? But we actually have a lot we can learn from other countries, including on areas like land use planning. So in countries like Japan or France, pick your example, they have something that looks kind of like zoning, but it's different in two really important ways. The first is the process. They don't allow local governments to have complete control over these policies in the way that we do in the US, right? Higher levels of government will say, here are the 8 to 12 zoning districts that your local government can map. You get to map them, but you don't get to write your own zoning ordinance completely from scratch. Another thing that's different is even most other countries that have something like zoning, it isn't nearly so strict as in the US. So your typical residential zone will allow a range of residential. It might still have to be low rise, might still be capped at 3 stories, excuse me. But you can have a range of residential types. You can have neighborhood serving commercial. I think these are useful models for us to learn from and to realize some of the weird elements of the US system. Back here stateside, right, we have cities like Houston. Houston's not an all-purpose model for city planning. Houston made a lot of the other city planning mistakes that most other US cities made. But they didn't make one mistake, which is they didn't adopt zoning. Unlike any other US city, Houston actually put zoning to a vote 3 times. Voters voted it down all 3 times. This is, on the left there is a sign from the protest, the most recent referendum in 1993. I love this, zoning kills dreams. I want to track her down and figure out if her dreams came true. But so Houston never adopts zoning, and for all of Houston's other planning problems, Houston actually remains one of the most affordable and diverse cities in North America. Even despite explosive population growth and explosive economic growth, Houston still remains a place where a normal middle-class family can move and afford decent housing within a 30-minute commute of jobs, high-quality jobs, right? High-quality universities. We shouldn't take that for granted. Sometimes I'll point to Houston in a place like California, and I think people have maybe a tendency to scoff, like, what could we learn from Texas, let alone Houston? And it's like, well, many tens of thousands of Californians have moved to Houston and other parts of Texas that have relatively liberal land use rules, right? So in a place like Houston, because they don't have zoning, it's easy to take those strip malls that maybe don't make a lot of sense in 2023 and turn them into mixed-use multifamily buildings. It's easy to take that single-family home and turn it into some townhouses. These are the type of small incremental changes that cities naturally undertake over time to remain affordable and accessible. And if we allow them to do that, they actually do that. Of course, the book isn't necessarily just an argument against all city planning. I think there's a lot of really important stuff that we need to do even within land use planning. So while I think the project of saying we're going to determine what uses are allowed where and at what scale for every single parcel, while I think that project has basically failed, we do need to do things like regulating impacts, right? The externalities, as economists might call them, behaviors that cause problems for neighbors, right? Stuff like noise or smoke or smells. It's perfectly appropriate to regulate for stuff like that. I think another reason that people agitate, though, for really restrictive zoning rules is that they don't trust local governments to actually regulate impacts. If I can't trust that, if we allow a corner grocery, that corner grocery is going to maybe keep the noise down or not have music being piped out, late into the night, then of course I'm going to be opposed to it. Similar thing with the impacts of new development, right? So I think a lot of people say, well, if someone's parking on street, maybe they're dependent on on-street parking space, someone might say, well, I don't want any new development near me because I struggle to find a parking space. Why would I support new development going in, right? But in the same way that we can do a better job of managing nuisances, we can also do a better job of managing the public realm, right? Residential permit passes, having actual rational on-street parking management. These are the really, really important land use and transportation planning functions that, in our focus on zoning and our focus on determining the appropriate use for every single parcel, we somewhat bizarrely neglect these much more core functions. Of course, the local governments also have an important role to play in determining the broader infrastructure growth of communities. I encounter so many suburbs where they have these incredibly detailed zoning codes, right? How close can a home sit to the property line? How much square footage of commercial space can you have? What specific businesses can you run everywhere? And then they won't even have like a streets plan, right? They won't even have a plan for like the streets to extend outward over time as the city grows. And then of course all the water and sewer that goes with that. We micromanage what happens on private land, and then we sort of just negligently, willy-nilly allow whatever developers want to build to happen in the public realm. And I think this is actually precisely the opposite of what we should be doing. You look for city planning for so many millennia was literally, people sitting down and coming up with streets plans that would allow for, congestion mitigation and free flow through the city, identifying in advance of growth, hey, this is where our parks are going to go, this is where we're going to put the schools, this is where we're going to put public services in advance of growth. So then you can tell private property owners, here's where the public realm is going to be, and you can do whatever you like on the public realm. That historically was actually the focus of city planning, and I think if you look back over time, it built some of our greatest cities that would be illegal to build today, but that now we cling to, in many cases, preserve. So now that everybody is super radicalized on zoning, what can you do? Like I said at the top of this section, we're in a moment now where like people are reckoning with a lot of these rules for the first time in a really serious way. This has been spearheaded by the YIMBY movement, people who say, yes, in my backyard, yes, I want more housing to be built, I want more variety of housing types, I want more choice in the type of neighborhood I can live in. Talking to planners and elected officials. Of course, a lot of these planning rules are dysfunctional, but in many cases, actually, city planners, including yours truly, know that and are trying to fix it. And then, of course, we need people to build the housing. We need people to get out there and actually build the different varieties of housing that our communities so desperately need. Thank you all for coming. I look forward to the conversation. I think we have some time. So, yeah, thanks again.
We have about 15 minutes for questions.
Cool.
What are some productive ways you found to engage with people who are scared of these changes? They're like used to space infrastructure and like they kind of get afraid of roundabouts and stuff.
Oh yeah. Well, roundabouts are a different story, right? Yeah, I mean on roundabouts the traffic safety data is just clear, and I think you should tell people. I think people had this reflexive notion. They're like, roundabouts are really dangerous. And it's like, no, like they freak people out for the first 2 weeks and then they're much safer. I think it would depend, right? I mean, so take housing, for example. I think a lot of people are reflexively like, well, I don't want any new housing near me. The traffic's going to inconvenience me. It's going to raise my property taxes, blah, blah, blah. Right? I mean, you can argue on those terms. In many cases, like the project that's being debated, like the marginal impact of that is just so small to be sort of not noticeable. The way I've found to frame housing issues, though, my model is that people support housing if they think they or someone like them or someone that they love or someone that serves them is going to live there, right? I think, right, when people oppose housing, what types of possible tenets do they talk about, right? They talk about like people from outside the community or investors. But I think if you can frame these projects in terms of, hey, like you're, talking to your aging parents, for example, don't you think you might want to downsize at some point? And, a 2-bedroom condo might be perfect for you, right? Or, hey, when you moved to the city, there were affordable, smaller homes. Don't you think we should be allowing a few townhouses so new families moving to the community have that opportunity? A lot of Mountain West cities, I think, are reckoning with this problem because literally, like, they can't attract teachers and firefighters and people that work at supermarkets, and God forbid, people that run the ski lifts, right? Like, that's like motivating a lot of like expensive mountain towns to say like, well, we need to figure out a way to build some additional housing. So, maybe I'm a little bit cynical, but I find that if you frame some of these proposals in terms of, hey, you're going to benefit from this. You might not live in that housing, but somebody like you will, or you might in the future, or someone who makes your life comfortable will. Yeah.
Thank you. Since I guess one of the main oppositions to this is that if you build so many more housing, then and people still bring in cars, it's going to create traffic congestion, like you just mentioned. But with the Houston example, when they built the 25,000 extra homes, do we know if there was a significant impact to like traffic congestion at that time?
Yeah, well, so, right, take a case like Houston. They need to build 25,000 homes. So they have two options, right? Well, three options, I guess. They can do nothing, right? They can just not build those homes. And home prices are just going to go up. And people who grew up in Houston are going to get priced out, and people are just going to stop moving there. The economy is going to slowly sputter out. Option number two is all of those people can go live in homes on the periphery, right, like on the edge of town, where they're going to have really long commutes and they're going to generate a ton of traffic. Or they can live closer in, which is the route that Houston actually took, in communities where actually there probably are bus lines. Like many of those people might have bus commutes, or if they do drive, they have very short car commutes where they might not necessarily have to get on the freeways. Or, Houston's been making investments in improving their bus service and their light rail service. That's the route that Houston went, and I think it was wise. I mean, Houston still actually beats LA pretty handily on traffic congestion. Houston does a lot more congestion pricing. So at peak traffic congestion, if you want to get on the freeway, there's going to be a small charge. And they do that because, right, like, you need to provide people with some incentive to shift their driving to a lower traffic time of day, or to carpool, or to take a bus, right? In LA, we haven't done that, and I'm sorry to say that we have not solved traffic. We just keep adding lanes to freeways, and then people keep filling them up. But so, yeah, the heart of your question, I think, is important. You do need to be taking mitigation measures, but this is a valuable example because if you allow housing in closer in places, actually, you get less of these traffic impacts and infrastructure burdens than you do if you were to build all those homes out on the periphery.
With that, what's the proper ordering for that? Like, do you want to provide proper transit solutions and then allow for increased density in hopes that like they'll be used, or do you wait until you have traffic congestion and then offer like the alternate transportation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, that's the classic transportation planning question, right? Do you like get the density first and then the transit, or vice versa? I think we have to be able to like walk and chew gum here, right? Like, I was just in Vancouver, and they've done, I think, the very wise course where they build the transit, but even in advance of the transit getting built, they start allowing a lot more of the density around future stations, so it gets built up. By the time the transit's actually built, there's a large population of people that can support the transit, right? And, unlike in the US, it actually largely pays for itself, on a user fee basis. So you need to be able to do both. I mean, there have been cases, right? Like if you go out to, just to give another DC example, if you go to Tyson, right? Like they built the Silver Line, and then like they're slowly, green fields are being filled in with new multifamily. Sometimes that happens, right? In many US cities, you have very dense neighborhoods that could probably sustain transit if you built it. So it depends on the context, and I think you need to be doing both. But I mean, to your point, like a lot of U.S. cities have kind of done transit planning in the dumbest possible way, right? I'm not going to name names, but many cities like built transit out to the middle of nowhere and then didn't allow like new infill around the stations. And then they're like, it's the weirdest thing, nobody's taking the train. And it's like, well, you didn't allow anyone to live within walking distance of the train, and you thought everyone was going to like drive and park their car and get on a train. They're not going to do that. So you need to be doing both at the same time. Yeah.
With a city like Hillsdale, where there have been, I think I was like looking at the like city planning things, that only 15 new buildings in the past like 10 years. Whenever these like plans change, like where do we expect the timeline to be for us to actually see like meaningful improvement? Because like Hillsdale can change their like zoning laws, but if nothing really gets built with the new zoning laws, then it's kind of pointless, right?
Yeah, right. I mean, like, if you're legalizing something for which there's no market demand, yeah, you're not going to get it. Yeah, and I mean, you know, sometimes it's a matter of like talking to your development community, because I mean, you know, for example, in California, we've legalized SB 9, for example, duplexes and small lot single-family homes, and we weren't seeing a lot of these units getting built. In part because I think a lot of the development community just didn't realize that, hey, you have this option now. Or they were waiting for someone else to do it first, right? And then they could go to their financier and say, hey, I have a comp. Like, this thing already got built. So, you know, I mean, real estate can be a little bit conservative. So sometimes you legalize some of this new stuff in a certain area and it takes time to get built. So you need to do outreach and communications. Sometimes, right, jurisdictions will maybe ease up on some of their zoning rules, but not others, such that the infill that they thought was going to happen is still not financially or physically feasible. So that's where you actually need to be talking to the people that actually build the housing and saying, in contexts where you have good rules, hey, we have good rules, here's something you can build, we'll fast track it. But then also listening to them and saying, what are the barriers to, you know, the type of infill or the more naturally occurring affordable housing that we need.
Are historical homes just strictly a bad idea? Because where I grew up, about 40% maybe of the downtown neighborhoods are strictly historic homes. And, you know, a lot of people would say that is part of the character of the city, is these houses that are, you know, a century and a half old.
Where are you from?
Ann Arbor.
Ann Arbor, okay, yeah. Yeah, I mean, if 40% of inner suburban neighborhoods are in a historic district, yeah, that's probably bad.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we've kind of gone a little bit crazy with this. I mean, this is something that I mentioned in the talk, like I don't touch on it, but I think, of course, everybody would agree they're historic properties. They're landmarks that we want to make sure we preserve. Somewhere, in even some exceptional places, there are whole neighborhoods that probably are worthy of preservation. I think where it's gone wrong is that people, NIMBYs might adopt these rules in entire neighborhoods that aren't particularly historically significant, but they want it because they don't want anything new getting built near them. And I think that's a misuse of historic preservation that I have preservationist friends who have no trouble calling that out, saying like that, no, like this doesn't make a lot of sense. You know, a healthy city is growing and changing over time. It's not locked in amber. A city's not a museum. And I think a lot of cities seem to think of themselves that way, and I think it's deeply unhealthy. I'm much more favorable to landmarking. If you have outstanding structures, landmark them. But if you're saying huge chunks of your cities are effectively going to be subject to landmarking, then you're setting yourself up where you literally just can't. The inner suburban neighborhoods, the parts of your community that are closest to downtown, just can't change and grow and adapt over time.
Building off of that, like, what is your opinion on regulation that determines like what the facades of buildings should, like, just the outside should look like to fit in with like the character of the neighborhood or something?
Yeah, so there's another popular alternative to conventional zoning is form-based code. Form-based codes say we're not going to regulate the uses that go on in the building. We're not even going to regulate things like the amount of floor area or the number of units, but we're just going to have rules about what the building has to look like. I think in theory that's like much more preferable, right? If you just have rules about like what you want the facade to look like or how you want the building to engage with the street, to my mind, those are actually things that might potentially impact other people. I mean, I think it's not on the level of like noise or smell or, you know, smoke, but like aesthetics, you can make an argument that these are minor details that if you get them right, like they improve the overall visual character of the community. Yeah, I think those things can be vastly overdone and become very restrictive. So you got to be careful there. And then also too, I often see rules like that just getting overlaid on top of zoning. So like communities say, well, in addition to regulating use and density and all this other stuff, we're now going to add an additional layer of rules on what your building looks like. I think that's, a mistake. I also think too, if you're going to do design review, have clear rules, right? Like, this is what we want it to look like. These are the materials that we like. This is the roof pitch, etc. Don't do it where you have a design review committee, where you have like a group of 7 people who kind of have unlimited power. I think most people in this room can probably realize like that goes haywire, right? And you kind of have like 7 people on an ad hoc basis deciding what every building looks like. That's not healthy. Please.
Have you found that, so when something's rezoned, more houses get built, it's more affordable housing, but does it impact gentrification positively or negatively?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think in a lot of U.S. cities, the situation we're in now is that it's very hard to build housing in existing urban areas near job centers. So young professionals, young couples say, well, where can we afford to buy a home? And it's in a low-income neighborhood, right? Now, so if that low-income household owns their home, good, right? That's a windfall for them. They're going to get, the home's going to go up in price, and they're going to collect that and move away. Community character is going to change, but ultimately those homeowners are fine. The concern becomes when you have homeowners who don't want to sell, who maybe their property taxes are going up, and they're getting priced out of their home, or if they're renters, and rents are slowly going up, and they're getting priced out of their neighborhood. And so because in many cities we have a zoning regime that actually makes it hard to build additional housing in high opportunity neighborhoods that are really close to jobs and maybe really close to high quality transit, all of that demand gets shifted over to low income communities, and there's a lot of price pressure there, and people end up getting displaced. I don't think it's inherently a bad thing for communities to change over time, or for communities to be, that were maybe once historically all impoverished, becoming more mixed income and more diverse. I actually think that can be very healthy. But if it's happening at a really rapid rate and folks are getting displaced and priced out of their home and they don't have anywhere else to go, I think people have completely valid concerns about that. I think the way you slow down that type of catastrophic change that is really disruptive to people is you need to be allowing more housing to be built in the high opportunity neighborhoods where people might want to live. So you reduce the pressure on those lower income, more marginalized communities. This is another thing that just goes wrong with zoning, right? Is that a lot of communities will say, yeah, we need to build additional housing. Nobody wants the housing to be built near them. And if we try to put it in wealthier areas, those people are going to have a meltdown and recall us and fund my opponent's campaign. Let's just put all the new housing in lower income neighborhoods. And they can deal with the cost of their communities changing. And I think people are understandably upset about that. I think the problem though is that people say, well, yeah, the problem is the new condo building being built in a low income neighborhood. And they fight that, but they don't realize that that's happening because there's a rich neighborhood across town that hasn't built a single new unit in 30 years, right? There's kind of this crowd pleaser here at Hillsdale, right? There's the seen and the unseen. People see the gentrification happening, but they don't see the neighborhood that is not building housing that's causing that gentrification to happen. And I would add too, I think a lot of, on that point too, a lot of people will say, well, if we allow new housing to get built, all the housing that gets built is luxury. But there's another seen and unseen there. They see the new unit that's really, really expensive, but what they don't see is that the people that moved into that new unit are moving out of an existing unit, right? And then someone's moving into that. Researchers have actually studied this. They studied chains of moves following even a new luxury building getting built. And what they find is that in about half of cases, there's actually a chain of moves that extends all the way down to the bottom of the market, right? So there's this whole giant game of musical chairs that we play, but instead of taking away a chair, we've added a chair, right? Everybody gets to upgrade to a new unit. So people say, well, we allow new housing to get built and it's all luxury. Yeah, but each new luxury unit that gets built, right? Every 100 new units that get built, in 50% of cases, people all up and down the housing ladder actually get an upgrade. Housing abundance helps people at all income levels. Of course, you need to be having programs that are prudently designed for people who might be at the extremes, right? They might never be served by the market, right? Very, very low income people might need some sort of assistance, and that's appropriate. But in a healthy housing market, the vast majority of people can go out and find a decent home in the market.
That seems to be our time. A big hand for Mr. Gray.
Thank you.